Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jeroen Doomernik. I'm affiliated with the Amsterdam Center for European Studies, as well as the Institute for Migration and Ethnic Studies. Both these institutions made our lecture series possible. So I'd like to say that I'm very grateful for this. Before I introduce this afternoon's speaker, let me spend a few words describing the context in which we are organizing this. It's this year, 25 years ago, that here in the city of Amsterdam, the Council of the European Union came together and drafted the Amsterdam Treaty, in which it was decided, among other things, that there should be more collaboration on the issue of asylum and refugees. And so there should be drafted something called the Common European Asylum System. And the idea was that properly dealing with asylum and refugee protection required solidarity between the member states and the willingness to share responsibility among them. But the problem was with the Common European Asylum System, I think my reading of it is that it included the Dublin Convention. And the Dublin Convention leads to a very uneven distribution of burdens and responsibilities between the member states, because it simply says the first country you get into is the one that's responsible for you. And it's pretty obvious that this means that the countries on the outer borders of the European Union get many more asylum seekers than the ones like the Netherlands in the middle. But anyway, the Common European Asylum System was further developed and more or less finished by the time that the summer of 2015 saw the arrival of many asylum seekers coming through the Balkans. And this is also the year that Angela Merkel famously said, "We are schaffen das." Well, it's not entirely obvious that actually that was successful. For many countries then started closing their borders, fearing mass influxes. And this got as far as that it actually challenged the integrity of the European project as a whole. And so something had to be done. And the solution came with the EU-Turkey agreement, which actually meant that further travel through Turkey and Greece was made impossible. And at present, we've reached a stage where nothing much has happened. There's a new pact on asylum and migration being drafted by the European Commission, but it's not leading to anything new, presumably. So therefore, this lecture series tries to analyze what the options are, what might be meaningfully done, or are we actually seeing the end of the ambition of having joint European asylum and refugee protection? That's the main issue that we want to talk about. And our first guest is Gerald Knaus. He is the chairman of the European Stability Initiative, and he hails from Austria, but he has been studying in Oxford, in Brussels, in Bologna, and he taught in Ukraine and spent a whole decade working on the Balkans in Bosnia and Kosovo. And he's been publishing extensively on the issues that we're going to talk about. And he just told me that because he's actually the architect of this agreement between the EU and Turkey, 2016. And he just told me that he has actually published on how that actually came about. So for those of you who are interested in that part of history, it's to be found online and in German and in English, I think. Right, without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Gerald Knaus. We're very happy to have you here this afternoon.
Well, thanks a lot, Jeroen. Thanks a lot to the University of Amsterdam and to all of you for being here. And let me first apologize that I will approach the issue without directly referring to the Common European Asylum System. But as you will see at the end, and certainly in the debate, I would be very glad to explain why what I describe about misperceptions about Europe's borders, migration, irregular migration, refugees in the world and in Europe in particular, and the misperceptions that have been dominating this debate condemn us and condemn member states to fail to produce what I think most European citizens still want, which is humane borders, borders where the rule of law, the principles we have in our conventions and in our laws and our treaties, from human dignity to the right to claim asylum, are upheld. That's why I called my presentation the perfect incoherent and how you might get to a good, or rather humane, asylum policy. And I will at the end sum up what this means for not just analysts, but also policymakers. Let me start with a general reflection though, about how words change reality. Because I will talk a lot about misperceptions, concepts, problems, but the difficulty is that a lot of the cliches that describe migration, concepts we use a lot, are the ones that we remember. Let me therefore say, I sometimes say this at the beginning of presentations, why you are likely to forget most of what I say and why I will have to struggle that you remember something. Because in fact, well, let me move this so you can actually read it. Because in fact, as this famous French writer, Michel de Montaigne said, human memory is very frail. He actually said that most people, he's forgotten most of the books he's ever read when he picks them up again. He's even forgotten the books that he has himself written. This isn't something that you as students are not familiar with. I am familiar with this. I pick up essays I wrote a year ago and I've forgotten them. And this is particularly problematic for policymakers. I deal a lot with politicians. And one of the big challenges is actually presenting them with information that sticks to their brain, that they remember. There is a lot of research on memory. I always tell this to my colleagues at ESI, at our think tank. This is what we need to beat. We need to have analysis and facts that stick. Montaigne had it easy. He had a tower. You know, he was from southern France. He was mayor and politician for a while, but then he had this library tower, which is a great place where it was quiet. But policymakers, here the German chancellery, they don't have that luxury. And when I deal with policymakers in Berlin, in The Hague, in Brussels, in Paris, and elsewhere, these are people who are incredibly busy, who are besieged by information, who are constantly asked to respond to crises, and who have very little time. The life of a policymaker is one where it's hard to remember things. And this is why some of the cliches and misleading facts that I will be describing are so prominent and popular. Now, I would like to refer you to this book, a book by a Swedish, actually medical doctor and development expert, Hans Rosling, Factfulness. If you haven't read it, I recommend it highly. And Rosling talks about the mega misconceptions of human beings. We have an over-dramatic worldview, which is based on our instincts. It comes natural to view the world through lenses of, well, through psychological mechanisms that make things appear more dramatic than they are. And the only way to cure that is with what he calls factfulness. But he also says that, and this is himself giving a speech as a sword, you know, swallowing a sword, that actually it's the strange things that we remember. You know, he does that when he does presentations. I won't do it here. I won't have a sword for you. But he does that so that people remember, because he says what we remember are images and stories. We struggle to remember facts. But if we don't get the attention of policymakers with what we present, their interest in what we have to say, and motivate them to act, there will never be any action. And this is where we get to the paradox of the European Common Asylum System. We've had discussions for years now, circles of discussions, many working groups, many presidencies announcing things. But if I look at the interior ministers or ministers of justice in member states, what proposals have caught their attention, have got them interested personally to say, this is something I will push for, have given them a sense of motivation, and have led to action. And we discover that very little has happened in the last few years in Europe. This was a former German Minister of Interior who wrote a book in German, Governing, Thomas de Maizière. He was the Minister of Interior at the time of the refugee crisis. And he describes in this book, which he wrote after he retired from politics, that the interest of busy people is to be presented solutions. He says, as a policymaker, you don't need to be presented problems for which there are no solutions, because that you constantly come across problems, right? And he also says, as a minister, you don't need to worry about getting advice. Everybody gives you advice. But what you rarely get is advice linked to a solution. And by solution, it's not do this, it's how you could get there. And finally, to conclude this introduction, there is this book I recommend to any student of politics, which is Dale Carnegie's classic. You find it in airports. It's still sold, although it was written decades ago, because it's so good. And Dale Carnegie talking about how people get influenced, and I think of this when I meet politicians, has this one key principle, that the only way to actually get people to do anything is to make them want to do it. So you meet the Minister of Justice of the Netherlands, or of Germany, or of France. I was invited by the Minister of Interior of France a few months ago to Paris. And you meet them, and then, you know, whatever you tell them about how big the problems are, they will listen to it and say, well, I know. What is your solution? And when you tell them a solution, they will think, is this good for me? You know, that's just human nature. And if you don't have an answer then, if you're an NGO, an advocate, an expert, we are an independent NGO, we don't work for governments. If we don't have an answer then, the meeting will pass and it will be one of the meetings of that minister that he will very quickly forget. Now, my colleagues and myself, I should say this, we are an independent think tank. We don't work, I mean, we didn't get any money from the German government or the Dutch government when we proposed things in 2015 on the refugee convention. We have independent donors who don't tell us what to do, but our influence only relies on the quality of our proposals. If we persuade people, we have a chance. If we don't, we'll be on our meetings and our words will be forgotten. So what doesn't help in debates on the future of European asylum and border and migration policy are imagined perfect solutions where we can't offer a way how to get there. And I'm sure you will recognize some of the proposals in the debates, or incoherent solutions which are full of contradictions. So what could work? Well, what I will put to you is that factfulness, questioning cliches, understanding what has worked before are the only way to break out of the current impasse, where at the moment, Europe's borders are definitely not humane. And I will do that in 5 parts. I will first talk about cliches about borders, cliches about migration, and trying to replace them with an understanding of the facts. Then ask the question, who in Europe has a coherent plan for what should happen at borders and with irregular migration? Then look across the Atlantic and show why good intentions are not enough, the disastrous failure of President Biden to do better than President Trump. And finally, why there is today an opportunity in Europe, focusing a little bit on this city where I'm speaking now, Berlin. So let me start with cliches about borders. And let me start with a border in the middle of Europe, which is now one of the richest parts of the world, between West Austria and Switzerland. This is the old Rhine, as it is called, the Alpine Rhine, before it goes into Lake Constance. On the one hand, you have the Swiss canton of St. Gallen, and on the other hand, you have Vorarlberg. Now, this is today, of course, a Schengen border. Switzerland joined Schengen, so you don't have control of people traveling. It's largely invisible, lots of prosperity, lots of exchange. But not that long ago, after the Anschluss of Austria in 1938, when Adolf Hitler came into Vienna, he sent this man, Adolf Eichmann, who was one of the executors of the Holocaust, to Vienna. This border to Switzerland became one of the most dangerous borders, and in fact, most cruel borders in the world. Because Alfred Eichmann actually had a task, which was to expel through terror the 200,000 Jews of Vienna. This started already in March 38, and by November 38, with the pogroms that took place then, the terror reached such extent that most Jews wanted to leave Vienna. There were 200,000, but there were not many countries willing to take them. And so some of them, not having any visa to go anywhere, tried to cross the border into Switzerland, that border I showed you, to escape from terror. Now, at that time, the Gestapo and the Nazi authorities had a strange philosophy, because they did actually want Jews to leave. Sometimes they even took them to that border, but they said, if you're caught and if the Swiss send you back, you end up in a concentration camp. By 1941, policy changed. After 1941, leaving Germany for Jews was a crime. then the policy had changed to actually try to kill everyone. But what I would like to focus on is Switzerland. So the Swiss are a democracy faced with an incredible humanitarian and human tragedy in the Third Reich, hundreds of thousands of Jews, 500,000 it was in 1938 in Austria and Germany, under enormous pressure, terror, trying to escape to a safe place. And Switzerland is traditionally a country of asylum. But Switzerland had this Heinrich Rothmund, chief of the foreigners police, for decades before the war and long after the war. He was in this position, and he had a very clear philosophy. He wanted to stop irregular migration. He was an anti-Semite. He really didn't like foreigners. And so his strategy to try to stop German or Austrian Jews reaching Switzerland was, well, to work with the Nazis and cooperate. And secondly, to push people back. So Switzerland engaged in massive pushback. 25,000 Jews from the Third Reich were pushed back in the course of a few years. The result of this was tragic, but unfortunately, the policy was very effective. By the end of the war, of the hundreds of thousands of Jews who didn't manage to escape to another country and who would have liked to leave, only 2,203 were in Switzerland from Nazi Germany. So the policy worked. The desperation, the fear of losing your life, of concentration camp, of torture, did not mean that German Jews were able to cross that border, which actually raises a profound point. At that time, with very little technology, Switzerland was able to stop a massive, potential, desperate group of people crossing the border. So what is the fact? That borders can be closed by force. This is something that in the debate in recent years, I've often heard people with good intentions say, well, borders cannot be closed. We cannot stop irregular migration. It won't work. But the reality is that we have the Refugee Convention not because borders cannot be closed, but because they could be closed with inhumane methods. It was in 1951 in Geneva, another Swiss border town, that states agreed that they would not do what Switzerland did, push people back into danger. But it wasn't because the Swiss failed, it was because the Swiss were effective that this was so important. So here is my first fact for you to remember. If you hear somebody say, irregular migration of desperate people will not be stopped because climate change will force them to leave, state collapse, war, people will be leaving in large numbers, think of Heinrich Rothmund and the Swiss-German border and ask yourself, why would states today not succeed at what Switzerland succeeded between 1938 and 1940? And this explains something. It explains why there is so little irregular migration across borders in the world today. Now you will say, but wait, can that be true? Is there very little irregular migration in the world today? Well, let's look at it. But the reality is that in fact, and this is a fact, states can stop irregular migration by force. We know, because Australia has done it recently too. Here it isn't the land border, it's the sea. Australia decided in 2013, the second time actually, and I wrote about this, and I can send you the link for this as well, to basically say nobody will come to Australia irregularly by boat. Nobody. The policy was a combination of pushbacks by the Navy and putting a certain number of people on some islands in the Pacific and saying anybody who comes by boat will never be allowed to stay in Australia. So this is their official publicity, public information. Australia's borders are closed to illegal migration. They chose two places, Manus, which is an island part of Papua New Guinea, and Nauru, which is an independent island republic of 10,000 people. And 3,000 people around were detained in two camps on these two islands. So basically anybody who came after the summer, after 2013, was put on these camps. There were 14 suicides. I wrote also a chapter, which is also available in English, on the massive human costs of this policy. It's been described by Australian doctors, by NGOs. There have been films made. We know how cruel this policy was. It also was incredibly expensive. The estimates, well, these are not estimates, these are official Australian numbers, are that it cost around 600 million euros a year since 2012. Actually, it cost as much to detain these few thousand people as funding the entire Australian justice system. But the cost didn't deter the public or the politicians. It's still a popular policy. It is popular because it stopped all irregular sea arrivals since 2014. There have been no boats arriving in Australia. And as you might have seen recently, Australia has a very tough policy. The Minister of Migration can decide to expel anyone if they want to. And they have maintained this policy. And although at that time, at first, there was criticism 10 years ago by the Labour Party, the opposition, today the Labour Party supports it as well. So the two big parties, 90% of MPs and the majority of the public support this policy. Now, this was a sea border. Another example of a land border, Israel. Israel signed the Refugee Convention. You don't have irregular migration into Israel, almost none. There was a period when some people from Eritrea and Somalia managed to get into Israel. Sudan, Eritrea, and Somalia managed to get into Israel across Egypt. Then the Israelis built a fence, they put military there, and people don't cross anymore. There are pushbacks, of course, illegal. Human Rights Watch has written about it, but the flow of irregular migration, the arrivals, has basically stopped. But more interestingly, there are no Syrian refugees in Israel. Israel has a border with Syria, like Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. But people have not been crossing into Israel. When there was a fear that they might, I have this a newspaper article from a few years ago, the defense minister just said, we will not accept any, and we will send the army. Now, that worked. People were not able to cross. And today, in fact, it's not just Israel. Today, if you try to cross from Syria into Jordan or Turkey, you are also not likely to succeed anymore. Fences have been built, soldiers are at the borders. Today, you are trapped in Syria. And actually, something very similar has happened to Afghans in Afghanistan. Finally, this is a picture of arrivals in the Aegean by boat from Turkey to Greece. And I just highlight 1 month. These are the number of people who arrived in this month. And what you see, this is April 2016. In the 12 months before, it starts here, 13,000 in April 2015. In those 12 months, 1 year, 1 million people, if you add this up, it's 1 million people arriving. That has never happened before. The year before, it was 40,000. The year after, it was 26,000 in the 12 months that followed. But in one exceptional year, it was 1 million people. Now, at that time, a lot of books were written about mass migration being the wave of the future and what are we going to do. But in fact, in March, the EU and Turkey reached an agreement and the number collapsed from 1 million to 26,000 within weeks. So clearly, public policy, in this case, it wasn't pushbacks. It was an agreement with a neighbor, controlled irregular migration sharply. So if, and I get to that agreement again, but if irregular migration across land and sea borders can be sharply reduced by force or agreements, and if this is in our democracies generally popular, if in general where it is done, the public welcomes it. And there are many, many examples. Today, of course, example of what Greece is doing at the border with pushbacks, or Croatia, or Hungary. If it is generally popular and effective, why is it not happening more? Well, the reality is it is happening more and more. And if we open our eyes, we see that today we live in a world of almost universal pushbacks. At almost all borders in the world, people are being pushed back by border guards, by force. Now, the first cliche I would like you to remember is borders can be closed by force, with an enormous cost. And of course, the cost is also that we give up the Refugee Convention, which was written because of that experience to treat people differently. The second cliche is a cliche about migration. We have this cliche that, and when I talk about migration, I'll focus mainly on irregular migration, because regular migration is a decision of governments. They say, we want people to come in, they allow them to travel, they allow them to come, they give them residence permits. That's not so interesting for this debate. For this debate, what we care about is people who cross borders with no permission or invitation by governments. And the cliche is that this is increasing fast. There is more and more irregular migration in the world, of refugees, of irregular migrants for different reasons. And climate refugees will mean that this is going to increase further. And the image, this is the theory. The theory is that this is because of what people call migration pressure. It's like a term from physics. Pressure is building up. And the reason is war, as here in Syria, or repression by autocracies, autocratic governments, or poverty. There's still 1 billion people in the world in absolute poverty, or climate change, desertification, natural catastrophes, pressure on people to leave their land. Demography, population growth, this, you hear it a lot. Africa's population is going to double in population size by 2050, and that creates migration pressure. And then, of course, what you don't see here, this man has a telephone, a mobile phone in his hand. Communication. So people learn about wealthy countries. It's easier to communicate, technology. This increases migration pressure. And this means people will cross by land, as here in 2015 in Southeast Europe, in the Balkans, or by sea, as here between North Africa and Italy. Well, you then get these reports. That's one of many reports published recently on climate refugees. Approximately 1 billion people, it says, live in countries that will not have the capacity, resilience to deal with ecological changes. Many of them, in the report, it says perhaps 1 billion will have to flee from their homes. And you see this graph, this goes until 2050 and says more than 1 billion people, if we just project the current developments, will be displaced in the world. There is also books, many, I just know this one. I had an interesting debate with the author recently, Parakana. Its book is called Move, and his theory is 4 billion people will have to leave from the global south to the global north. And he then thinks of these towns you can build in Siberia or elsewhere where these people might be housed. Those who have to leave. And then we have UNHCR. Every year, UNHCR publishes a report. Every year in summer, the Global Trends report gives a number, the number of forcibly displaced worldwide. This was in 2019. The report actually came out in 2020, but this was the number at the end of 2019. Almost 80 million people displaced. And last year's report was 82.4. Now, I'm sure if you deal with migration, you've heard this number. And every meeting you go to, when people talk about migration, they will say, as we all know, there are more refugees in the world than ever before, and it's 82.4 million. This number is completely deceptive. I'll get into this in a second. If you analyze what this number consists in, and we are producing a big report on it soon, you realize that this number is misleading. Why? Well, let me first go back to the concepts, the language, the words we use. We talk about migration using terms from the natural sciences, migration flows, communicating vessels, streams, images of water, even journalists. It comes natural. Why not? Why not use images like this? But the problem is it creates a sense that it's a natural force. Of course, we also use the language of physics, push, pull, pressure. Now, push and pull effects, some of the least useful debates in recent years have been on whether there exists push and pull effects in the Mediterranean or not. The language itself is the problem, and I'll get to that if you want in the debate. So what do we really know about what is likely to happen? Well, there is a report by the World Bank which says that by 2050, there might be 140 million climate refugees. Then there is this report I just quoted, which says there might be 1 billion. And quickly you realize, wait, 1 billion, 140 million, that's a pretty big difference. The reality is that we don't know anything. And we can't know for a very good reason. Let me go back to the number of refugees. In the 82 million that UNHCR presents, There are a lot of groups that are actually very strange to be included. For example, why does UNHCR include 5.6 million Palestinians whose great-grandparents were displaced in 1948? At that time, 700,000 people, 800,000 people were displaced from what is today's Israel. By now, with their children, these are 5.4 million, 5.6 million people. Actually, only the male line is counted for some strange reason. Only those of parents of parents who've been displaced. And it's by now 5.6 million. Why they are counted, I'm not sure. They clearly have not been displaced in the last decades. And until 15 years ago, UNHCR didn't count them. It just added them to the list to make the number bigger. Before that, it didn't count them. UNHCR is not working with them. There's a separate UN organization. Now, what UNHCR also counts is a lot of internally displaced people. For example, 8 million people in Colombia. UNHCR does basically almost nothing for the internally displaced in Colombia. I mean, it doesn't get much money for it. It's not its priority mandate. I'm not saying that you shouldn't help the internally displaced in Colombia, but these 8 million are actually a very strange number because it's not the number that other experts, including the experts on which UNHCR usually relies, are giving for Colombia. They give millions less. But let me just focus on refugees, which is people who've crossed a border. And let's leave out the Palestinians who didn't cross a border in the last 60 years and look at those who crossed borders in the last few years. And what we see is amazing. And it's very, very interesting. According to UNHCR, there were 20.7 million refugees under its mandate, which is including the Palestinian descendants. At the end of 2017, there were 20 million. At the end of 2018, there were 20.4. At the end of 2019, there were 20.4. And at the end of 2020, there were 20.7. What they don't count, I should add immediately, for some internal bureaucratic reasons, is Venezuelans going to Colombia. So this does not concern this one group, but everyone else in the world is included here. So what you see is that except for Venezuelans, the number of refugees in the world in 4 years only increased by 700,000 in 4 years. That is very, very little. But it's even less people crossing borders. Because according to UNHCR's own analysis, which is very reliable and very credible, in the last years, every year, 320,000 refugees become refugees by being born to other refugee parents. In Turkey, in Lebanon, in Germany, in Sweden, in Canada, in Bangladesh. So if you have 700,000 more refugees in 4 years, but every year you have 300-something thousand more refugees born as children, wait, you discover that who is crossing borders as a refugee in the last 4 years? Where in the world are people succeeding to cross borders and then be seen as refugees and counted by UNHCR? You get the impression from their own numbers that contrary to the image that there is more and more people crossing borders everywhere in the world like an irresistible force, actually in recent years, very few refugees cross borders. And that is the reality. But this is not the communication. Look at this tweet last summer by the head of UNHCR, Filippo Grandi. He tweeted this, just read the first sentence. In 2020, 82.4 million were forced to flee. Now that suggests, actually, that doesn't suggest, that says that in the year 2020, 82 million people were forced to flee. You get the impression, and I know many people understand it like this, that these 82 million are people who've become refugees recently. When in reality, of course, in the last 4 years, very few people, and this is what UNHCR's mandate is, refugees were able to cross any border. So there is a big gap between the presentation and the reality. Now here, sorry, I don't know if you see that. This is the year 2013 and this is the year 2020. I wanted to show you where in the world the number of refugees has increased since 2013. Now, what you see is between 2013 and 2020, in these 7 years, the number of refugees in Turkey increased by 3 million. In Uganda, 1 million, 0.2. In Germany, 1 million. In Sudan, 900,000. In Bangladesh, 835,000. These 5 countries together took almost 7 out of the 9 million additional refugees. Here you see it. Between 2013 and 2019, now it's a little bit more, 9 million people more are refugees. And where did this growth happen? In Turkey, in Uganda, in Germany, in Sudan, and in Bangladesh. So what you actually see is that there has been a vast increase of refugees between 2013 and 2017 in 4 years, and then the growth stopped. So my question is, why were these people able to cross the border? Because they had to flee? No. They still have to flee. There are still many Syrians who have to flee today, and many Afghans, and many people in Yemen. They were crossing the border because the countries at the border let them in. Turkey had an open border. That's why Turkey became the country of most refugees in the world. It was a political decision. It was not migration physics. Turkey had the border open. Any Syrian could cross without a visa from Lebanon. You could fly in. You could go in from Syria. You no longer can. In 2015, Turkey, after terrorist attacks happened in the border towns, started building a fence in the summer or autumn of 2015. But you could, for a while, cross. Now, Uganda had a policy of letting people in. Germany, of course, had a policy, as we know, of welcoming people for who managed to reach Germany. Sudan and Uganda, it's largely people, this new increase from South Sudan, the fighting there. And Bangladesh, it's basically one big movement of Rohingyas, of Muslims from Myanmar into Bangladesh a few years ago. So this is the growth in refugees in the last few years. And what we see immediately is it fits our theory. This is because governments basically accepted it. Much of this is because of policy. And when governments put soldiers at the border, like now Afghanistan's neighbors, Afghans can no longer leave. It's politics, not desperation or migration physics, that explains the number of refugees in the world. Now let's look at Africa and the concept of migration pressure once more. Now here you have the number of Nigerians who in recent years reached Europe irregularly across the sea. And what you see is that in the year 2010, the total number of Nigerians that were recorded in Italy arriving irregularly was less than 600. It then increased to the record number of 37,000 in 2016, and then it fell sharply in 2018, and now it's again at around 1,000 a year. So basically, this is from a country, this is from a country with 20 million inhabitants, with more than 80 million inhabitants in desperate poverty, absolute poverty, with millions of internally displaced. So why is this interesting? Because it shows us that, in fact, migration pressure, there's huge demographic change in Nigeria. There's massive poverty. There have been lots of instability, in particular in the north with Boko Haram, actually doesn't translate in large migration. Why were 37,000 Nigerians arriving in Italy in 2016? There were 3 years in which more people arrived because of Italian policy. At that time, in those 3 years, Italy had a policy of sending its boats, rescuing everybody off the coast of Libya, and bringing people coordinated by the Italians to Italy. When that policy changed in summer 2017, the number of people arriving in Italy dropped sharply. Now, let me say one word about migration in general. This isn't irregular migration, and this is why, if you hear these numbers, always be very careful. IOM, in its last World Migration Report, talks about 280 million migrants in the world. And you see here how this number has increased. Be careful. That number includes me. I am a regular migrant. And many of you, if you are not Dutch, in the Netherlands, you will be in that number. In fact, this is largely regular migration. For the refugees, they take the numbers from UNHCR. But this isn't actually a very high number, because this is the stock. So people who are still counted in some countries from 20 years ago are still in that number. It's actually not been a massive increase. And of course, this is regular migration. This is what governments allow. 280 million migrants in the world, the stock. Compare this just to the population growth in India in the last 32 years, where the population of India increased by 600 million. So just what happened in India was more in the last 3 decades than the whole global migration stock. I mean, almost 3 times more. So when you hear that climate migration will be 140 million until the year 2050, which is 28 years from now, the World Bank published it 32 years before 2050, 140 million climate migrants, and you put it in context with the migration that is ongoing right now across the world between countryside and cities, you realize this is really a very careful number. This isn't really very spectacular. The reality is we don't know how many people will be able to cross borders because it will depend on the policies at borders. So the fact is that there is in fact very little irregular migration in the world. And that is because most states control their borders. And that is something that is often forgotten in our debates. So let me come to the third point. Who has a coherent plan of control? And here, of course, we need to immediately get into the core question, which is this control that is in line with the Refugee Convention of human rights? Or is it control, as I've described it, around the world that is not in line with the Refugee Convention? Pushbacks, violence, deterrence through inhumane treatment. Well, let's ask who has a plan in Europe at the moment. And the reality is that some have a plan and had one for many years. And that the fear of mass migration, even if it isn't happening, plays into the hands of political hardliners, like him. Viktor Orban has been Prime Minister of Hungary for a very long time. He's the longest serving head of a government in the European Union. And he has been saying since 2015 that migration is a war. Irregular migration is mass migration, is like a conquest of territory, he said in a speech, in many, many speeches, but just one from his election campaign in 2018. So for Viktor Orban, the promise from 2015 was, I will stop it. And he had studied history, he'd studied what Australia did, and he said, I can stop it. The only thing he said is, I have this problem with these liberals who believe in human rights and open borders. So I will actually describe them as traitors because they are helping the enemy in this war, which is the migrants. And I will try to repress them, make it difficult for them to work in my country. Otherwise, I will just carry out a policy of control by force and others in Europe will follow me, he said in 2015. He gave a speech in early September where he said that what he is doing, Hungary is a front runner and other countries will follow because the new era in Europe will be an era of treating migration as a war. Well, if you think back just a few weeks to the debates on arrivals from Belarus to Poland, what you heard from everyone in Brussels was that these few thousand people were a hybrid war. Now, this was a warfare, you needed soldiers, you needed, I mean, Orban won the debate. Today in Brussels, that's how people speak about irregular migration of actually a relatively small number on the border between Belarus and Poland. Orban, of course, uses the fear of mass migration to say that if migration continues like this, he talked about it in 2018, when there wasn't much, we will lose our culture and our identity and our nations will cease to exist. And this is exactly how the Polish Prime Minister Morawiecki talked in 2021. We will not be subject to blackmail, he said, from Lukashenko, the Belarus dictator. He declared a state of emergency. Poland sent soldiers and pushed people back. In fact, Poland made a law in October that allowed pushbacks to Polish border officials. This law is obviously in violation of the Refugee Convention and European law, but it's what Poland is now implementing. And the European Union keeps praising Poland. You've done a good job, we hear. Recently, from the European Commission, from other governments. So far, I haven't heard a single government criticizing the Polish law from October 2021, a law that allows pushbacks. I mean, I haven't heard one government say this needs to change. And of course, what is Mr. Morawiecki, the Polish Prime Minister, saying? He says there will be 50 million coming. Now, we already know this is crazy, but he basically says 50 million unless we stop these few thousand at the border with Belarus. And a lot of people, because they are used to these big numbers, think, well, perhaps he has a point. Now, if it's a war, you can ignore the laws. At least that's what Orban and Morawiecki say. And of course, you ignore the European Court of Human Rights here in Strasbourg. You ignore the convention, the European Human Rights Convention, which doesn't allow pushbacks, or as it calls, mass expulsions, and you ignore EU legislation, like the Schengen Codex, which clearly says that non-refoulement, the obligation not to push people back without a procedure, is part of EU legislation. Now, Poland has a law like Hungary, but it passed it in 2016, which allowed it to push people back into Serbia. And it's been doing that for years. The European Commission took Hungary to the European Court of Justice. And an infringement procedure, it lasted 4 years. First, the Commission needed to start the process, then it went to the court, and the court took 2 years to decide. And in December 2020, the European Court of Justice issued a judgment. Very clear. The Hungarian law that allows pushbacks is in violation of EU law. That was December 2020. The next day, the Hungarian Minister of Justice said, we don't care. We will just ignore the European Court of Justice. We will continue. And Hungary continued. Hungary is still doing these pushbacks. And Poland passed the same law. So the question for us now in Europe is actually, we are having a very bizarre situation. We're having a discussion in Brussels about a new European common asylum system, while the laws that we want to amend are basically ignored at the border already. And we don't even discuss this anymore when a country is sentenced by the highest court of the EU, like Hungary, or another country does the same kind of law afterwards. It's not a crisis. We don't hear much in Brussels, which raises the question, what are they discussing? If laws don't apply, why are we changing laws? I mean, we first need to restore legality, right? We need to have the rule of law so that laws matter. Of course, Orban also keeps telling about millions that will come from Africa unless Europe does what he's recommending. The reality is, of course, that very few people come from Africa. I already hinted at that when I talked about Nigerians. Here is the total number of people who crossed the sea in recent years to Italy from Africa, which is basically Tunisia and Libya. And what you see is that you had 4 exceptional years. In 2014, and here, 170,000, and 2017, these 4 years, you had a high number, more than 600,000 people arrive in 4 years to Italy. But before that and after that, the number was very low. Why? In those 4 years, these were exceptional years in which the Italian Maritime Rescue Coordination Center in Rome coordinated all the rescues in the whole Mediterranean, all the way up to the Libyan territorial waters. And then it stopped. So in 2017, 2018, Italian policy changed. But in those 4 years, this was the policy. And that policy, of course, meant that a very large number of people got into boats, were picked up by the Italians, and were brought to Italy. Now, we'll get in a moment to the numbers today. But what you see is in the 15 years before, that didn't happen. The average of people arriving from all of Africa to Italy between 1999 and 2013 is around 25,000, which is not very many. And of those, not everyone is a refugee. So you get a sense why there are so few refugees reaching other countries irregularly. Irregular migration a year on average, and this is just to sum it up, always 5-year periods. There were 5 exceptional years when it was around 150,000 a year, and most years it's around 42,000 a year in total. And this isn't just Italy, this is also Spain. So Italy and Spain together, irregular migration from Africa in most years since 1999 is around that number. So suddenly you realize this is a very low number. This doesn't even help very many refugees. Unfortunately, it's a very, very dangerous and deadly journey, and many people die. Now, let me go to the fourth point. Why good intentions are not enough. For a moment, let me leave Europe and let me go to the United States. Europeans like to think of themselves as superior to especially the kind of naked populist chauvinist policies of Donald Trump. I mean, most Europeans don't like him, and we know that what he's doing, you know, no Muslims should come into America. The refugees convention should stop irregular migration. You know, this rhetoric and of course his fence is not something that is very popular among many Europeans. So when Donald Trump was thrown out and lost the White House, people thought, well, good. In the last fiscal year, that's how Americans count refugee statistics. It's from September to September. In the last fiscal year under Trump, this is what happened at the border with Mexico. You had around 460,000 undocumented migrants apprehended, which is the border guard, the border and the protection, the police, stopped them in the US. And you had around 200,000 expelled. Now, this Title 42 is interesting. It's something Trump discovered and he loved it. It's a health code. So he said, because of the pandemic, you can expel them under Title 42 without allowing them to claim asylum. So it's refoulement. So these people, even if they have been even if they are real refugees, would just be expelled without an asylum procedure. Now, this is Trump. When Biden came into office, the number of irregular migrants suddenly increased. Why? Well, he's been saying in the campaign that he would have a humane policy. He would not be like Trump. And for whatever reason, although the pandemic continued, in the last year, the number increased dramatically. Here are the numbers. 1.7 million undocumented migrants were apprehended in the fiscal year, most of which under Biden. This is the highest number since 1960. Now, compare this with Europe. This is incredible. You know, I've just said Africa, the number of people coming from Africa to across the sea is around 40, 50, 60, 70. In a high year, 1,000 a year. Well, in the US, it's been 1.7 million. This is a record. But what is also a record is the number of people that Biden expelled under Title 42, which means with no asylum procedure. 1 million people. That's extraordinary. I mean, this is basically showing to the whole world how one big power is just expelling people without any procedures. Under Trump, there were, remember the numbers, 400-something thousand people were apprehended. There were 60,000 asylum decisions in his last year, and 14,000 people were what the Americans call granted relief, international protection. That's very little. I mean, America doesn't give much protection. In that year, there were 247 deaths at the border. But remember, just for 1 minute, this number. 14,000 people were granted protection in the last year under Trump. 8,000 were granted protection in the year after that under Biden. And the number of deaths has doubled. The number of asylum decisions has gone to almost a third. So Joe Biden makes a campaign and says, I want a humane policy. I am not Trump. And I believe him. But he has no plan what to do. And then he arrives, he becomes president, and suddenly instead of 460,000 people, 1.7 million are apprehended at the border. And he doesn't know what to do. Under Trump, 200,000 were pushed back. He pushes back 1 million. The number of deaths has doubled. The number of people who get asylum has decreased. So I would say this is a pretty desperate failure. In addition, it's very unpopular, as you can imagine. The people who say Trump had control and Biden lost control, of course, criticize him for this. But the people who said we want a humane policy, which is no pushback policy, criticize him also. Because, of course, there have never been more pushbacks or legal pushbacks, which means under Title 42, in the history of the US. And it's very unpopular. So let me go back to Europe. 5, an opportunity. This is the picture of the 3 leaders of the parties that formed the new government in Germany. And I will say something about Germany and something about Europe, about how perhaps Europe might get out of the current situation. And the question, of course, is, here's the border with Belarus, where people have died this last few months in the forest. Will the EU stop pushbacks? And now that we know that pushbacks are almost everywhere in the world, that most countries, including the United States, legally or illegally are pushing people back without checking their claims, the big question is Europe going to be an exception? And is Europe going to stop deaths at sea? This is the total number of people who died in the Mediterranean. This is just, the central Mediterranean. So what you have here this year, the 4,581, that was 2016. I talked about 2016. It was the year when Italy did most rescue efforts in the history of the Mediterranean. They coordinated them and they rescued and brought to Italy 180,000 people. But it was also the deadliest year in the history of the Mediterranean. Never have so many people died, which isn't surprising because more people got into boats and more people were not rescued than in the years before and after. Now, in 2020, the number of people who died was below 1,000, but still that is a very high number. And recently it has gone up again. Last year it was 1,300 in the central Mediterranean. So what are humane borders? Humane borders, I would say, are borders where people don't die in those numbers, but also where people are not treated inhumanely. So you don't put people in a detention and like the Australians have done, or like we've seen in Greece or now in Poland, and keep them in detention for 12 months, 16 months with no clarity what will happen. And also a humane border is one without pushbacks. You don't push people back without a procedure. But how can you get there politically in Europe today? Who do you need to persuade? At a moment when in Brussels, the big debate is not having a solidarity or not. The big debate in Brussels today is, should Hungary and Poland be the model for everyone? Should everyone do pushbacks? Because that's, of course, what Croatia and Greece are interested in, because they do pushbacks, but they are not legal. So if they could just make them legal, like in Poland and Hungary, isn't that the solution? So that, I fear, is the debate at the moment in Brussels. And so the question is, can you have humane borders without pushbacks? The German coalition government treaty says these things. It says Germany should respect the convention. The EU should respect the convention. There should be no pushbacks. There should be renewed sea rescues. We should again have boats rescuing people. An end to deaths at sea and suffering. For this, if the EU can't agree, get a coalition of countries to go ahead, which is just realistic. And then you should offer more regular migration and resettlement. But, and it's repeated twice in the coalition treaty, the German government also wants to reduce irregular migration. Now, how do you do that? How do you respect the convention, have no pushbacks, have fewer deaths, save people, and have fewer people arriving? This only works, the treaty says, with migration partnerships and fast returns of people arriving who might not need protection in Europe. You might recognize this. This is the EU-Turkey statement. This is the idea of the EU-Turkey statement, that you don't push people back. People arrive, but the idea is that you have a partner that says, we will take them where you can legally return them because they are safe there. And this discourages people getting into boats. That is the core idea of the German coalition treaty. And today it is the only coherent alternative to the Hungarian-Polish proposal, which other governments in Europe are backing as well. So a pilot that could work would look like this. In the central Mediterranean, where 1,300 people died. Europeans would again coordinate sea rescues, but you would reduce irregular migration through returns to a safe country. So you would rescue people, but you would make an arrangement with a third country that people could be returned there. But of course, that can't be Libya, because Libya is not a safe country. I mean, Libya, there's torture and people are mistreated and people are raped. And no, it has to be another country. And that means you need to make an attractive offer. What could that offer be? Well, for example, there isn't a single country in Africa that has visa-free travel for its citizens. Could you offer a country visa-free travel? That you say, like we've said with Ukraine, which has offered to do exactly this. Ukraine takes back everyone who crosses irregularly from Ukraine. In return, Ukrainians got visa-free travel. And so Ukrainians can travel to Europe since 2017, just on their passport. This kind of agreement in the central Mediterranean is Europe's best, no, only bet to both save lives and become independent of Libya. But it requires effective diplomacy. It doesn't work if you don't have a third country. And that is why I think the big debate in Europe today isn't what Europeans discuss among themselves, but is if Europeans have a plan to offer partners something that is credible, that could work. We need that to save lives. The last year, the number of deaths has risen again. This is from an accident in April. In the world, IOM says 5,000 missing migrants, which is people who I assumed who died crossing borders. In the world, last year, 5,000. Of these, 2,000 are just in the Mediterranean. So the Mediterranean is the deadliest border in the world. 2,000 is an incredible number. I mean, this should really be a crisis. European governments should meet and say, what do we do to stop this being the deadliest border in the world? But why aren't they meeting on this? Because they don't have a plan. They don't know what to do. So they rather not talk about it much. Actually, here you see the total number of deaths coming to Europe is even more. It's 2,561, because you need to add those who cross from Africa trying to go straight to the Canary Islands, which are the Spanish islands in the Atlantic. So 2,561 deaths on the way to Europe last year, which is half the number of deaths in the world at borders. And it's people like that, young African men who called for help for 48, well, they called for help for 24 hours, then they went silent. They were found 48 hours after they started calling for help in April last year between Libya and Europe. But when they were found, they were already dead. 130 people in one accident. So these are the faces of this tragedy. Now in 2021, the same number, but now on arrivals, 113,000 people arrived in Spain, Malta, Greece, Italy, and Cyprus, which is a bit more than the long-term average, but it's still, well, it's still not obviously a million, 113,000. What is interesting is who these people were. The biggest groups were Tunisians, Moroccans, Bangladeshis. There were almost no Syrians, very few Afghans in this number. So most of the people who've crossed into Europe last year are not from the traditional refugee countries and are not likely to get refugee protection. But now I need to move this again. In November last year, just to Italy, this is just 1 month, 9,500 people arrived. And that, I think, is a sign that we might actually have a new situation again. There is now more rescue again in the central Mediterranean. People are being taken more quickly to Italy and Malta. And for some reason, there are, again, more people getting into boats. The situation in Libya is becoming worse. I mean, it's really very bad for non-Libyans. And so if 10,000 come in 1 month, this was just November, if this is the trend now, we would have again more than 100,000 arriving in Italy next year. I guarantee you this would be a big political crisis in Italy at a year of elections. So we don't know what that will mean, but one thing is clear: Italy is likely then to try to reduce these arrivals in the way it did in the past, which is problematic because it involves probably working even closer with Libya. If we want to avoid this, and that's what I tell the Germans, then we need a different policy. This is what happened last year. 32,000 people were moved back to Libya by the Libyan Coast Guard, stopped and intercepted, which of course is moving them back into a situation where they end up in camps which are inhumane. So what is the most realistic alternative? How can we get to a humane border? I've already talked here again, the Aegean, about how an agreement with Turkey reduced the numbers of arrivals. It didn't close it down to zero. This agreement actually said that pushbacks are illegal. Greece is not allowed to do pushbacks under this agreement. It confirmed the refugee convention. In a period before that agreement, we had 1 million people arrive in 12 months. There were no pushbacks then. There were no returns. There were many deaths. 1,100 people died in that year before the EU-Turkey statement. There was little support by the EU for refugees in Turkey, and the number of refugees in Turkey kept rising. This was for these years. Then in March 2016, this is the period when we had the EU-Turkey statement for 4 years. During those years, around 30,000 arrived each year. Much less than before, much more than now. And I get to this because in April 2020, the EU-Turkey agreement stopped. During the years of cooperation with Turkey, this is what happened. You had some returns to Turkey, 2,100. You had a lot less people arrive, 150,000 in 4 years. You had 6 billion euros given to refugees in Turkey. The 3 million, I mean, Turkey is the country that took in a third of all the new refugees in the last few years in the world. So the European Union funded healthcare, education for them, and the number of refugees in Turkey remains stable. Now, when this agreement collapsed in April 2020, the number of arrivals collapsed as well. So today, Greek politicians say it's even better without an agreement with Turkey. We have even fewer arrivals. But there is a problem. Now, this is achieved with pushbacks. So now, since April, Greek authorities grab people even on the islands, put them on little plastic boats and push them back to Turkey. And you can see this on the Coast Guard's, Turkish Coast Guard's website. But of course, lots of journalists and human rights groups have written and researched this. So what is the situation today? Very few arrive each month, 200, 300. There are regular pushbacks at sea and at the land border. There are no more organized returns. Turkey takes back nobody. There is no agreement with Turkey that works at the moment. There is no more FRIT, which is the money for refugees in Turkey. The EU is not promising more. Very little new money is being spent. And the EU is violating EU and international law. So basically, between these three possibilities, I'm arguing that we need to go back to a working agreement with Turkey. We need to find a way that without pushbacks, few people arrive, that we keep helping refugees in Turkey, and that we bring refugees from Turkey in an organized way. The realism is that there will be no returns to the open border of 2015. There isn't a single, of course, there's not a single party in Greece that is in favor, and no government in Europe. So the control will be either through cooperation or, like now, through confrontation and pushbacks. And that is the other big debate in Brussels. In confrontation, everyone loses. The Geneva Refugee Convention, refugees in Turkey, because they are now, even without EU support, is phasing out. Turkey itself, because it has to face this challenge alone, and the EU, because rule of law matters. If you have returns from Greece to Turkey in an organized way, which reduces the numbers of people who come, and you have resettlement of refugees from Turkey to Europe, as was agreed, in a larger number, the voluntary humanitarian assistance scheme, and support for refugees by the EU for those who stay in Turkey, actually, it's better for everyone. It's better for the Refugee Convention. It's obviously better for the Syrians who remain in Turkey. Turkey gets financial support for this huge number of refugees, and the EU can return to the rule of law. It no longer needs pushbacks to control the border. Do you like this? Perhaps not. But if you meet a Minister of Interior anywhere in Europe, what is your alternative proposal that you think they will listen to, and that people in Greece, which we need on board, will listen to? I tell you, it's very hard to convince them of this because pushbacks work so well. But of course, pushbacks are illegal. So the argument one can make in Europe is that Europe is a community based on the rule of law. So pushbacks shouldn't be the policy. So we need a new EU-Turkey statement. with 3 or 6 billion for the next 5 years for refugees in Turkey, with more resettlement of refugees as the EU has promised, with returns from a day X as was agreed, with an end to pushbacks and extending it to the land border. It would be win, 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 win. It's hard to get. I'm not sure Greece and the EU want it now, but if they don't go to this, they will keep the pushbacks. That's what I fear. And then we need to widen the context. Because of course, people from Afghanistan don't even get to Turkey anymore because Turkey has closed its own borders. So what one needs to do, and I close here, is look at legal ways. Legal paths are often talked about, but what are the legal paths for refugees? If they can't cross borders, they can only arrive through resettlement. But there have been fewer resettlements in 2020 than in many, many decades. In all of the world, according to UNHCR only resettled 34,000 people. Now, Canada resettles people outside of UNHCR. So Canada alone resettled 30,000, of which about 10,000 were by UNHCR. But very few countries do that. So the UNHCR resettlement figure shows you that there are very few legal ways for refugees in the world today. Last year was even less. Until end of November, well, or the same. Until end of November last year, 32,000 resettlements in the world of refugees by UNHCR. Canada and Sweden alone are 10,000 of them. The US is 10,000 of them. Resettlement is basically only the Western world. It's Europe, but they are mainly Canada and Norway, Sweden and Norway. It's Canada, it's the US, it's Great Britain, it's Australia. Luxembourg resettled as many people in the last 7 years as all of Asia. Now, there are so few resettlement also because very few countries are like Sweden. Sweden resettles 5,000 people a year. Germany resettled fewer than that. So the campaign my colleagues and I have been arguing for is that Germany should become at least like Sweden. If Germany would resettle, Sweden has 10 million people and resettles 5,000 refugees a year. That is 0.05% of the population. If Germany would resettle 0.05% of the population, refugees each year, that would be 42,000. If France does it, that would be 35,000. If the Benelux, France, Germany would act like Sweden, there would be 100,000 refugees offered a legal way just to those countries. And that is very realistic. That is actually more refugees that arrive across irregularly. So I think this is a realistic goal we should all campaign for. And I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gerald, for this very compelling talk, which offers indeed realistic options, I think, to our policy people. Let's just hope and pray that they will work